One, great to have you here. Good afternoon. We have a tremendous concluding program today for our fall semester here at the St. Elizabeth University Center for Holocaust and Genocide Education. My name is Dr.
Center for
Quillen.
Holocaust and Genocide Education. My name is Dr. Center for
Quillen.
Holocaust and Genocide Education.
And we are honored today to welcome author Seth Stern, who will be presenting, speaking, and answering questions about his book, Speaking Yiddish to Chickens. Seth is a legal journalist, editor at the Bloomberg Industry Group. He's previously reported for Bloomberg News, Congressional Quarterly, and the Christian Science Monitor. In 2010, he saw the publication of a book he co-authored called Justice Brennan, Liberal Champion. That is a text I strongly urge you to pick up, especially any of my history or political science majors who may be out there watching. He is a graduate of Harvard Law, the Harvard Kennedy School, as well as Cornell University. And as we were saying just before we came on, I am particularly happy to have Seth here because in a strange way, I feel like I know him a little bit, even though we've never formally met. I was lucky enough to be giving a presentation at Malloy University last year, and a wonderful woman came up to me at the end and was talking to me about this author, Seth Stern, and how he would be such a great program for SCU, and I really should investigate him and try to bring him in. And turns out it was Seth's mom. And so there was no possible way I could say no to that because no one is going to do better promotion for you than your mother. And so thank you to both Seth's mom and also, of course, to Seth for being here to talk about what is a truly, truly remarkable text. So with that, I give you Seth Stern.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Quinlan, for the invitation and for that very generous introduction. I'm going to show some photos here that'll hopefully give a sense of the time and place I'm talking about, so bear with me as I try to sync everything up. This book began, just to give you a sense of the origin story, more than 25 years ago, and while home on Long Island, studying for law school finals in December 1998, I visited my grandmother each afternoon over lunch and started asking her about her life. We talked about her growing up in Lublin, Poland, how she met my grandfather there at a high school dance, and how she was confined during the war in a small, overcrowded ghetto during the German occupation. They escaped to the countryside, where they hid for more than a year in an underground dugout in a Polish forest, and my grandfather fought as a partisan. Only about 10% of Polish Jews survived the Holocaust, and those who returned to the villages, towns, and cities where they grew up were met with hostility or violence. My grandparents fled to the American occupation zone of Germany, where they were housed in what were known as displaced persons, or a DP camp, in their case in the German city, well, really village of Bensheim. In my grandparents' case, they lived in that small town before boarding the Marine Perch, the former U.S. troop transport that brought them to the U.S. in February 1947. You can see here my grandparents on the right-hand side of the photo. My mom is the dark-haired girl on the right-hand side. This is aboard the Marine Perch in early 1947. In the years that followed those initial lunchtime conversations, I visited Lublin in Poland and Belzec, the extermination camp where my grandparents' families were killed in a gas chamber. But the part of her story that came to fascinate me the most is how my grandparents and roughly 1,000 other Holocaust survivors came to settle as poultry farmers in southern New Jersey. This is a personal story, and I explore in the book how my family and my grandmother's childhood friend came to share a single farmhouse for many years and raise their daughters as twins. This is the image from the book cover. My grandparents are on the right side of the photo. Again, my mom is the dark-haired girl, and her childhood best friend is on the left, and that's the her daughter, and they again raised them nearly as twins. They had, as in this photo, nearly identical hairstyles and dresses and shoes and dolls. But what I try to tell in the book is also a broader story about how Jews came to be farmers in the US and why survivors wound up in this unique South Jersey community anchored by Vineland, New Jersey, halfway between Philadelphia and Atlantic City. Now, just to give some context about Jewish agriculture, most Jewish immigrants in this country gravitated to big cities. But smaller numbers settled in rural America, whether that was Appalachia or Gold Rush, California, or the Mississippi Delta, where they started out as peddlers and often opened dry goods stores, small shops on main streets. A few had tried farming, often with the help of the Jewish Agricultural Society, which was funded by a philanthropist named Baron Morris de Hirsch. The first big wave of Jewish farming came in the 1880s when idealistic Russian Jews established communal farming colonies throughout the U.S. Most of those colonies failed due to bad weather, the farmers' inexperience, or malaria. The few that survived tended to be in South Jersey, where they were close to big markets in New York and Philadelphia. In the early 20th century, the Jewish Agricultural Society largely gave up on colonies and focused on settling Jews on individual farms. The Jewish Agricultural Society began publishing a monthly magazine, you can see it here, called The Jewish Farmer, which is the only Yiddish-English agricultural publication of its kind. On one side was in English, and if you flipped it over, as you could see here, it was in Yiddish. In the 1930s, Jews farmed in all 48 then existing states, but they were mostly concentrated in the Northeast, from the Berkshires in Massachusetts down through Connecticut, the Catskills in New York, and into New Jersey, including in central New Jersey communities like Lakewood and Farmingdale. The form of farming that tended to work out best was chicken farming. It required less capital, it was less physically demanding, and it required less land than raising cattle or crops. So when the first Jewish refugees to make it out of Germany arrived during the Great Depression, the Jewish Agricultural Society saw poultry farming as a great solution and looked to South Jersey as an ideal place to direct them since farms were cheaper there than elsewhere in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. There was an influx of refugee farmers in and around Vineland, a community of 30,000 people. You can see two of those families here, including the photo on the right the son likes to describe as their version of American Gothic. As this photo of Vineland's Main Street, Landis Avenue from that era shows, they moved to a community that looked like many small towns in that era. It had a Woolworth's Five and Dime, a Sears department store, a Pontiac car dealership. But it was also unique in many respects, with glass and clothing factories mingling with farms and many Jewish-owned businesses on the main street. The descendants of the original Italian immigrants tended to grow fruits and vegetables, and Jewish families stuck more to raising chickens. The displaced persons, as they were known, who had lost their families and came to the U.S. without much money and knew little English, were attracted to farming by the promise of being their own boss, and as the fact that, as my book title suggests, the chickens didn't care if you spoke Yiddish to them rather than English. Survivors dissatisfied with life in New York or whatever big city they'd initially landed in usually heard about poultry farming by word of mouth, whether it was a distant relative from their hometown or someone they'd met after the war in a displaced persons camp. Many newcomers who'd never farmed before and had little idea of what it involved expected farming would be easy. You don't do nothing, just collect the money, one survivor remembered hearing in Detroit before moving to Vineland, as if chickens laid $10 bills instead of eggs. As I'll discuss, the reality of farm life was much different. At first, timing worked out in their favor. These new arrivals, who suffered so much during World War II, benefited from the start of the Korean War, which drove up demand for eggs, and egg prices reached all-time highs in 1951. In this era, poultry was king in Vineland. The high school dubbed its football team the Poultry Clan. This was their logo that the athletes wore on their sports jackets. The city had billboards boasting of it being the home of Vineland eggs. Vineland even hosted a poultry festival that boasted the world's largest frying pan. You could see here, it was a frying pan so large that the cooks, the chefs, had to use hose to prepare the omelet. There were hundreds of local poultry, 500 purchased by Holocaust survivors alone. There were 17 poultry feed mills, 25 hatcheries and poultry dealers. And many of these businesses were Jewish-owned, such as the Rubinoff feed mill, pictured here, which was the largest of its kind in the eastern U.S. The Vineland egg auction was shipping 600,000 cases of eggs. That's 18 million eggs to New York City in the mid-1950s. And it wasn't just South Jersey. There were also other counties in central New Jersey that were among the top egg-producing counties in the country. Now, at the time, just to give a sense of the scale of the farms, the typical family poultry farm in Vineland was roughly 10 acres and housed 3,000 to 4,000 chickens. Most of these farms were raising egg layers. Others sold them for meat, known as broilers. Even in the best of times, this was dirty, difficult work. You had to wake up early in the morning to make sure the chicken's water hadn't frozen. You couldn't easily take a day off since the chickens needed to be fed 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Viruses would wipe out whole flocks. Wild dogs would snatch them in the night. Hens were nasty when cooped up together, as you see here, and could peck each other to death or smother each other in a panic during air raid drills. The stench of their waste could be overpowering when you walked in a coop. Brooder stoves used to keep baby chicks warm would catch fire and burn down the coops. The economics were tough even in good years, and finding reliable laborers proved challenging. Most of the newcomers who arrived during this period, particularly the refugees, had never farmed before and had no idea what they were doing. Many had grown up in big cities and found it isolating to live on a farm. Others who'd moved to farms from crowded New York City apartments found comfort in having so much land to themselves, even if they had to share their property with thousands of hens. Their embarrassing missteps became the butt of jokes among veteran poultry farmers and local veterinarians, like the farmer who washed his eggs in water so warm they hard-boiled inside, or the farmer who told to give his chickens a teaspoon of vaccine substituted an old family heirloom spoon 3 times too big and poisoned his whole flock. These were the kind of mistakes you only made once. Many newcomers who'd hoped for a stable, quiet life recoiled at the uncertainty and dropped out of poultry farming almost as soon as they arrived. One survivor lasted only 9 weeks raising chickens before he found a job making draperies and slipcovers at the Sears department store. But many of these new farmers stuck it out. As one farm wife later recalled, "You'd be surprised how fast you learn if you're in a jam. We had to make a living and take care of the children, and you just did it. We were fast learners. We had to be." Part of what eased the transition was the uniquely large Jewish presence in Vineland. I'd mentioned earlier how Jews had always settled in rural America, but by the 1950s, most rural Jewish communities had shrunk, as Jews, like everyone else in small towns, had started moving in large numbers to cities or on to suburbs. In Vineland, the descendants of the original farm colony settlers and the German refugees who followed had built a remarkably robust Jewish community full of synagogues, kosher bakeries, butcher shops, and delis. Decades later, so many people I spoke with recalled the taste of Goldstein's pastrami and the smell of onion rolls from one of the Jewish-owned bakeries half a block away. In the 1950s, Manischewitz opened a plant there to make borscht and gefilte fish, which boasted of using the famous Vineland, New Jersey eggs. So Vineland's eggs were famous, at least in these, well, if you were reading the Jewish newspapers where this kind of ad appeared, but the survivors, the refugees who were making them, were really invisible beyond South Jersey. The survivors themselves enriched this Jewish community and made it their own. They built small synagogues, often with their own hands, within walking distance of their farms. This is one with the Hebrew name for the surviving remnant, a term used to refer to the few who had survived the war. It was on the same block as my grandparents' farm. This is a favorite picture of mine when congregants at that small synagogue celebrated the arrival of their Torah. My grandfather is holding the staff in the front on the left. The survivors created the Jewish Poultry Farmers Association, a combination mutual aid society and social club like ones of earlier generations of immigrants established in big cities. Their association hosted dinner dances and stars of the Yiddish stage from Europe, comedians, poets, and journalists who were often themselves displaced persons who performed to standing room only crowds at the local high school, the only venue that could hold hundreds of people in the area. They also commemorated what later became known as the Holocaust. I've referred throughout to them as Holocaust survivors, but the term really didn't take hold, as you may have already addressed and earlier speakers might have addressed, until the 60s and 70s. You can see here is an advertisement, a flyer for an event in 1961. It was timed to the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in Poland, which was typical for survivors to commemorate that as a moment of strength and rebellion by Jews, even though it wasn't successful. The survivors kept to themselves at first. They later remembered feeling unwelcome by the existing Jewish community. Some recalled American-born Jews could be downright cruel with comments about how they must have done something wrong to end up in a prison camp. It's difficult so many decades later to tease out exactly the community dynamics. What survivors experienced as cruelty might have been fumbling attempts by American-born Jews unsure about what to say, unintentionally saying the wrong thing. Even the most well-meaning American Jews found it difficult to relate to survivors face to face. They had no conception of what survivors had endured or how to talk to them. Some survivors may have avoided American-born Jews because they felt self-conscious, although the earlier the German Jewish refugees recalled feeling equally unwelcome when they arrived, and I'm happy to dig more into some of those dynamics and the questions and answer. These distinctions tended to break down over time, the children of survivors and German Jewish refugees joking about intermarriage with the American-born Jews decades later. Many of the survivors' farmers had warm memories of their time there. Others hated every minute, but in general, many of the children tended to recall enjoying growing up there and shared memories of life on the farm that were both idyllic and dangerous. My mother's earliest memories, including petting soft baby chicks. This photo still sits on her shelf at home. She also remembered the sight of the rifle her father kept handy to kill dogs or wild foxes that were trying to snatch their chickens. She still laughs at the memory of her mother taking the grapes that grew on vines in the backyard and mashing them in the basement to make wine, like Lucille Ball did in I Love Lucy. Cultural reference that may or may not resonate depending on the age of the audience here. They had ample opportunity to explore, the children had ample opportunity to explore their physical surroundings and had a great deal of freedom to do so. The labor-intensive work of operating a farm meant the parents didn't have time to watch over their children that closely, and the kids had to entertain themselves, particularly during the summer. Nearly everyone recalled days on a patch of sand along the Morris River where the children played, teenagers danced at the jukebox, and their parents played cards while gossiping in Yiddish or Polish or Hungarian. On the one hand, the surviving children lived a very cloistered life, one full of Jewish poultry, Hanukkah Purim parties, and socializing with other farm families. But the grinna, the term that they used to describe themselves, and others did a play on the term greenhorn for newcomer, they also felt pressure to keep up with their neighbors and provide whatever they imagined a proper American childhood might be. So they made sure their kids signed up for Little League and Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts. This is my mother's troop of, I think it was brownies, sharing a cake with Vineland's mayor. At times, they could also feel uncomfortable cast in their small schoolhouse Christmas pageants. Some of the families avoided this dissonance by enrolling their children in the private Jewish day school that opened in the fall of 1953 in a renovated farmhouse. The growth of Jewish day schools was a nationwide phenomenon in the 1950s, but it was rare for one to operate in such a small rural community as Vineland. Only in Vineland could the eventual site of this Jewish day school share the same stretch of rural road as Jewish chicken farms, small synagogues, and the grounds of a rodeo horse show, as well as a nearby car racing track. As teenagers, the survivors' children watched Dick Clark's American Bandstand to pick up on the latest fashions, hairdos, and dance moves, while their mothers felt guilty if they couldn't afford to throw them a proper Sweet 16 party. The Jewish Agricultural Society and the survivors didn't know it at the time, but these refugees entered poultry farming at the worst possible moment. Small family farms were finding it increasingly hard to compete with mega farms that were opening in the South that had much lower labor costs, land costs, and could support 50,000, 100,000, and ultimately 1,000,000 chickens. In October 1954, Hurricane Hazel barreled through Vineland, peeling the roofs off of coops like the lids of tin cans and killing or leaving homeless tens of thousands of chickens. Given the hard times ahead, the lucky ones might actually have been the ones who got wiped out and could use their insurance proceeds to start over, whether in a new line of business in Vineland or moving out of the area entirely. Farm families looked for other ways to supplement their income as egg prices dropped throughout the late 50s and into the 1960s. Many of the farm wives, including my grandmother, found work in garment factories in Vineland. Others tried branching out into other businesses or abandoned farming altogether. And as the 60s progressed, most found it increasingly hard to make a living and began to look elsewhere. In the decade that followed, nearly every farm ceased operating, and the Jewish community in Vineland and the surrounding area began to shrink, just as it had in similar rural communities almost everywhere else in rural America. By the time I first visited Vineland in 2004 on my first research trip there, few relics remained of Vineland's poultry past. This is the farmhouse across the road from where my grandmother and mother had settled. You could see here the coops are abandoned and they would ultimately be torn down, even though the house would be standing for many years later. So just in conclusion, my goal, my hope was that I'd helped preserve this mostly forgotten chapter in a Jewish American history and give some sense of what this unique place was like in the era. I also hope, and this is something else I'm happy to talk about more, is that to show that Holocaust survivors weren't a monolith. They didn't all have the same experience in terms of where in America they settled, what they did here, how much success they had materially, how well they adapted and coped with trauma they had survived, and even how much they adhered to their religious practice from before the war. So happy to talk about any of that or address any other questions you might have. And thank you again for joining today.
Thank you, Seth. I have a few questions for you, but before we get into that, I would just like to say that for everyone who is on the live stream, if you would like to ask a question, you may enter it into the comments section. And we have our remarkably talented member of the IT department, Brandon Hutchinson, who's with us, who will be helping me moderate those. I'll ask those questions. So please, whatever struck you, whatever more you would like to find out from Seth, offer that into the comments, and we can make this a really robust question and answer session. As that's happening, Seth, I do have a couple of questions for you. I'd like to start with one about the book in general. What I found particularly endearing about the book is the way you balance the academic and the personal. So, as you were writing this, did you have a specific audience in mind? Did you want it to be largely more of an academic text, or
Sure.
did you see it as something that people who have an interest in this history, or even just local Jersey history, could would want to read?
Yeah, I mean, I did view it as a balancing act. I think when I started interviewing my grandmother, it was just to preserve our family history. And if at first I thought maybe I would tell my family story, I did come to a point pretty early on to say, no, I don't want it just to be about my family. I want to capture the experience of this community of survivors as a whole, but I also wanted to put it in that broader context. So if I didn't think to write for an academic audience, I'm a journalist and I've written some history or biography, but my goal was to appeal to a broader audience, but give a sense of the context, place their story in the broader story of Jewish American agriculture and the broader story of American Jews in rural America, so that I didn't just treat this as something that didn't have any context. So I hope I managed to do that, not just focus on their experience to the exclusion of the context, but not bury it in the broader stuff.
No, I think you did that brilliantly, and that's what makes the book so readable, is that it really can impact various audiences, and people can enter into reading your book for various reasons and get so much out of it. One of the lines that struck me very early on in the text is that you wrote that they, talking about those who had arrived and largely founded these poultry farms, were trying to find ways to, quote, commemorate what they had lost while trying to move beyond past trauma. And this might be a very difficult question, but ultimately, as you were listening to these stories and putting your work together, do you find that that optimism ultimately won out over past trauma, or was it always, as you said about the book itself, more of a balancing act?
It is. I really do think it's a range that it's hard to generalize about the survivor experience. I think there's a tendency to look at it as either or, that the survivors were all, and this was the perception, particularly in the 50s, if you read contemporary media accounts, that they were here, they came, they were damaged and haunted and ruined. Contemporary media. So that's one. And then the narrative that emerged later was, no, it's a story of triumph and how they overcame what they did. Both are true, either at an individual or at a collective level. I think some of the survivors were never able to get beyond the horrific trauma they had experienced. And it was at a time there wasn't necessarily the modern understanding of PTSD and trauma. There wasn't the counseling and psychological support that you might have today for refugees and other victims of violence or sexual trauma. So that's true. Some people couldn't get beyond it, and others did. And the reasons for that vary. And there's no formula that you could determine, but they varied in what they'd experienced. Were they in concentration, labor, extermination camps themselves? Were they in hiding, like my grandparents, in a forest, or passing in a city as non-Jews? How much family support did they have? And did they have family members who survived? And people just vary in how resilient they are, as a matter of, you could say, genetics or whatever it might be. So all of those factors combine to explain. But as a whole, I do think it is pretty remarkable. And this wasn't a successful endeavor for larger economic and structural reasons. Becoming chicken farmers wasn't the path to prosperity in America, but the community as a whole, and particularly their children, my mom's generation, were generally successful in many cases. So it is a hopeful immigrant story, and a hopeful story in terms of what refugees in this country, like them, who were at the time viewed with suspicion, whether they had the taint of communism or otherwise, and how much they've contributed to America. So in that way, it is an optimistic story.
Thank you. Just a quick reminder to everybody who's watching us on the live stream, make sure that you have subscribed to the St. Elizabeth YouTube page that allows you to ask questions and interact with us today. So anybody who's done that, please feel free to ask a question. And I urge everyone to please subscribe to the St. Elizabeth University YouTube page anyway, because it keeps you up to date with all of the remarkable things that are happening across the campus and everything that's going on here at our beautiful school. So while we wait for more questions to come your way, Seth, I want to follow up on something that you just referenced, because at one point in your presentation, you noted that a number of the new arrivals, they were not welcomed, that they themselves felt sort of outside of the community, and that those who were already here did not necessarily welcome them. So could you describe the types of anti-Semitism, or if it was just sort of a xenophobia that these recent arrivals faced when they made it to
Yeah,
Vineland?
the dynamics were complex, and I try to address it at many levels. You had the dynamics within the Jewish community and how welcoming or not welcome they were, and then between the survivors and the broader Vineland community, which in large part, but not entirely, was Italian American Catholic, who were themselves immigrants, one or two or three generations removed from uh, being newcomers themselves. In terms of the Jewish community, you had these two earlier waves of Jewish immigrants came in the 1880s, and then in the late 30s, early 40s, the German Jewish immigrants. And they were the establishment, the Jewish establishment. They were by the 30s and 40s professionals, or still in agriculture. But to some extent, perhaps they felt insecure in America at the time, where there was still anti-Semitism. They were somewhat assimilated, and then along come these newcomers who didn't speak English. They were poor, and there was a perception of them as ruined or haunted, and it threatened their own status. And so there is perhaps an element of that. Um, and there were many instances of them feeling unwelcome, but there were also instances of them feeling welcome. And I tell the story of the local the local daily newspaper was owned by a Jewish family that just was extraordinarily humane in how they covered them and welcoming at a personal level. There was a local lawyer, a Jewish lawyer, who was almost a one-man welcome wagon in terms of the help he gave in helping these refugee families buy farms. So it was a mix of hostility. There was some degree to which the newcomers kept to themselves. There was a repeat of the earlier dynamic of where in other places like New York, the first wave of German American Jews looked down on the Russian Jews who followed them. And so whoever gets to a place first might look down on whoever follows them. And that's a pattern you see repeated even to today in other communities. And then with the broader community in Vineland, you see similar dynamics where you had a mix of some anti-Semitism, and I'm not going to deny or minimize that there were instances of that. And then again, there were instances of tremendous humanity. One Italian-American farmer who would take a refugee farmer and his wife to the synagogue when they wanted to be able to on holidays to mourn those they'd lost, or another survivor family, they took their child had heart problems, and he would drive them to the hospital in Philadelphia. So just tremendous generosity as well. So it is a mixed story. I wouldn't want it to come across as just one or the other.
You were incredibly fortunate in terms of these lunchtime conversations you had with your grandmother, that she was able to share with you as much as they did. And you've learned as much about your family as you have. How willing were your grandparents and others of that generation? How willing were they to talk about what their life was prior to arriving in America? Do you know much of what
Right.
they were while in Europe?
In the case of my grandmother, my grandfather died. I was 11 years old. I was fortunate that my mom had the foresight to do a tape recording interview with him around 1980, and you hear me in the background. I'm a little kid, So I had that, but I didn't have a chance to. I started this long after he had died. My grandmother, and this is typical, it was very difficult for her to talk about her wartime experiences, which were awful. She found it somewhat easier to talk with me about it than my mother, and that was typical, where for reasons complex reasons, it was often easier to talk with your grandchildren than your children about it. More time had passed. You were so worried about damaging your children, whereas with your grandchildren, it was just a little different and more removed. And so she did talk with ease about Vineland, about being a farmer. It was much, much harder to get her to talk about, for instance, survival in a forest and living basically underneath the ground like an animal. That those stories very, very, very hard. I benefited very much from the Shoah Foundation, the Steven Spielberg initiative to interview survivors at length, and some people found it easier to talk about those wartime experiences, and they recorded so many, and those are digitized, and you're able to search. That's how you type in farming chicken Vineland, and you find the video interviews through the Shoah Foundation, and there are many other efforts to record the oral histories of Holocaust survivors. So, in addition to my reporting and interviewing people myself, I was able to rely on those oral histories because by the time I had started, so many of them had already passed away.
Well, thank you, Seth. We have great news. Not only are there comment questions, so that means everything's working from a tech perspective, but it also means that you no longer have to deal with me. So turn things over to some really great questions.
Sure.
Marjorie has a wonderful question. She asks if there are other family members of Vineland survivor families on the presentation. Did you get that?
Are there other survivors on this presentation?
Yes, in
That I
some of some of the images and the stories, does that also include other family members of violent survivors, or is
That
it?
I showed? Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, yes. I mean, the images I showed were not just my family. They were for instance, the boy holding the chicken. I've benefited even since the book came out. So many of families have reached out to me, shared pictures, and I have a Facebook page for the book where I've posted them. So I have dozens and dozens of photos of that others have shared with me. And again, that was part of my goal. I never wanted this just to be a family story. I wanted it to be a story about the other farming families, whether in Vineland or elsewhere.
Wonderful, thank you. Doug has a tremendous question as well, and I think this really speaks to what you and so many others are doing, Seth. That's so critical. He asks, how important do you think it is for 2 and 3G children to pass on these stories?
I think it's very important. It's funny, I wasn't really aware of the term 3G until relatively recently. I was so busy focused on this project. I wasn't sort of aware of the bigger picture of what people were doing. There was an article, I think, in the Times within the last few weeks about the grandchildren of survivors and the various novels they're writing and movies they're making. So I do think it's a broader effort that I wasn't necessarily aware I was a part of, but it's certainly something that many others are engaged in.
Are you now becoming part of that larger 3G community? Are you thinking about presenting with others and
I follow the New York and I live in the Washington, D.C. area, but I follow the New York and Philadelphia and D.C. 3G on Twitter or Facebook. And so I'm interested in seeing. I haven't attended any of those events, but I would be interested in engaging in that space.
wonderful. I do have while we wait for more questions to come across, I have a question for you about visiting Belsic. Just sort of your emotional response to walk on those grounds. I mean, for those who have not had the opportunity to visit it, it was one of the camps that the Nazis attempted to raise and utterly destroy. But there's a remarkably powerful memorial and museum that's there. So when you walked on that soil, how did you feel? What was your response and reaction like?
It's difficult. It's my grandmother never wanted to go back to Europe. My mom never went to Poland, has never been to Poland, has never been to Germany. I did so, and again, I don't think that's unique either among the grandchildren of survivors. Often might be the first generation to do so. I was there by myself. This project has worked. I've worked on it so long. I had the took pictures and brought it back to my grandmother, and she was very interested in seeing what her where she grew up looks like. Some parts of Lublin were raised by the Germans, others weren't. She was less interested in seeing Belzec. Um, for me, it was hard. I'm glad I did it. I don't feel a need to do that again. Maybe one day. My son is now 9 years old. I was at an age when I started this, I was closer in age to my grandparents, the age they were when they were survivors. My grandmother had a much younger brother who died. He was only about 9 years old, which is the age of my son. So my point of view has shifted more to the as a parent, being a parent, and from that perspective. So perhaps one day I would go back with my son, maybe.
Thank you. Lauren just typed in a wonderful question, very much something I'm sure you can speak to, Seth. She said, last year I attended a funeral in Vineland for someone who grew up in the Jewish community there. I was surprised to see a Holocaust memorial at the cemetery. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, there is a cemetery there. I believe it's in Alliance, which is where the one of the original farm colonies was. And that cemetery, I note in the book, is a place, whatever you would say about the divisions in the Jewish community, it's one place where sort of everyone's equal. You have all of the various subparts of the community are buried there. I'm pretty sure the memorial there was from Miles Lerman, who I write in the book. He came to the U.S. on the same ship as my parents, settled as a poultry farmer soon after my family, and went on to tremendous success in the oil business, the real estate business, and helped lead fundraising, and ultimately was one of the first leaders of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. And I think he helped build the memorial that's at the cemetery, as well as one at one of his synagogue in Vineland. So before he led efforts for the National Holocaust Museum, he was helping commemorate the Holocaust in Vineland at the cemetery and the synagogue. So that a credit to him and the other survivors for initiating that.
Wonderful. So how often do you get a chance to go back? Do you continue to go back to Vineland and keep in touch with other people that you spoke with within that community
Sure.
or
I don't have my family left in 1964, so I don't have family ties there. I made a number of research trips there, and people were just tremendously generous with their time and their memories in hosting me and sharing things with me. I did have an opportunity to go back and talk at the synagogue there at the start of this year, and it was a wonderful event. Really nice luncheon after, great kugel. So it was great to go back, and the feedback has been very positive. And writing a book like this, where I don't have any direct firsthand knowledge and come at it so many decades later, I did worry about how it would be perceived, would I capture it right? And that was a worry of mine, and I've been gratified, and not that I can't guarantee I got everything right, but in large measure, it's been relatively well received by those who experienced it themselves.
As well it should be. It's an outstanding text, and it's something that I really cannot urge people strongly enough to pick it up. It's a tremendous book. I know you are extremely limited with your time, Seth. We've had some wonderful questions today, and I want to thank you very much for being here. For those who may have joined us a little late, one of Seth's other works, for those of you who are interested, is Justice Brennan, the Liberal Champion, an outstanding text. So please, hey, holidays are coming up. And you're always looking for a great gift, and Seth has given you a couple of great options here. I'd like to thank everyone who joined us on our live stream, who asked such wonderful questions. If you could not get on the chat because maybe you didn't subscribe in time, but you have a question for Seth, you could certainly reach out to me. Reach out to Seth. He's Seth Stern at gmail.com. He has been incredibly receptive and quick to all of my emails, so I know he would answer all of yours. Seth, thank you again for your time, your effort, and sharing this remarkably powerful story with us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And as you so generously hawk my book, I should note that all the proceeds, it's very important to me that no one think I'm profiting off the stories of the survivor community. So any proceeds I've been donating to the Vineland Public Library, the local historical society, the Jewish Federation there, and the Center for Jewish History, which had the records of the Jewish Agricultural Society. So I just wanted to note that as well.
Makes it all the more important. Thank you, sir. And thank you to everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your week, everyone. And to my students or to anybody who's been joining us throughout the semester, thank you for your ongoing support of the center. None of this happens without all of you. So thank you. Happy holidays to everyone, and look forward to some great programming in the spring semester. Thank you again, Seth. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.